Okay, this is concept one of our absorption and excretion unit, and we are going to start with talking about the digestive system. And if you're in my class, we're going to do kind of an intro inquiry activity because I want to see how much you already know about this system because this tends to be one that students are more familiar with. So we're going to do a fun activity, but for now, for the sake of the video, we're just going to dive into these notes. So a little overview of the system. The overall function of your digestive system is to convert the food that we eat into the energy and raw materials that will build and fuel our bodies. So we're going to break down the food that we eat, release energy from it to use it, and then use those raw materials that have made up the food we eat to then build whatever it is that our body needs at that time. So the macromolecules in our food, those carbs, lipids, proteins that we've been talking about since biology 1, they get broken down mechanically and chemically into their simplest form. So we're physically going to break them down so they have a lot of surface area, and then we're going to use enzymes to digest them chemically as well. And we really want to be as efficient as possible and not waste things, which is kind of a theme you'll see throughout this unit. And so that's something that your body has gotten really good at doing. From there, these simplest forms of these molecules that we eat, they can be absorbed into our blood and then transported via capillaries and, of course, the rest of our blood vessels too, to wherever the nutrients are then needed in our body at that point in time. So our last unit, in unit 4, we talked about blood and how it is our transporter of nutrients in the body. Well, this is where those nutrients are coming from that our blood is transporting. It's coming from the digestion of our food. And I love this picture. It doesn't show every structure of the digestive system, as you'll see on the next slide. It's only highlighting a few because your oral cavity in your head, that would be up here, that plays a role also. But I like it because you can see some of the key organs of the digestive system within the context of some of the organs that were in the respiratory and cardiovascular systems that we covered in Unit 4, transport. So you can kind of see here how your esophagus, which connects to your stomach, runs behind your trachea or your windpipe. And remember, your trachea connects to your lungs. We have your heart right here kind of in the middle. You can kind of see how your esophagus runs back there. We're going to go through each of the structures of the digestive system in detail in some discovery stations. And one of my favorite parts about these discovery stations is that we're also going to talk about health issues and diseases associated with the different organs of the digestive system. So we'll talk about things like heartburn, how it's actually not in your heart, it's in your esophagus, but because it runs behind your heart or posterior to your heart, it feels like it's in your heart, it's in your chest. So those are all things we're going to get into throughout this unit. So let's continue with our overview and talk about the structures. So when we're thinking of the digestive system, we're typically thinking of the structures that make up the alimentary canal. This is another word for this is your gastrointestinal tract or your GI tract. So I'm going to use alimentary canal and then GI tract interchangeably. So just know I'm referring to the same thing. This is essentially just a hollow muscular tube that runs from your mouth and the hole that's there all the way to your anus, which is another hole in your body. And this tube is where the digestion and absorption of nutrients from our food is going down. If we were to stretch out your alimentary canal, it would be about 9 meters or 30 feet long, which is crazy. So in your actual body, it's not that long just because of muscle tone that you have. All of these we'll see have an assortment of smooth muscle and stuff in them. But just think that's 9 meters or 30 feet long is the pathway that your food is traveling through just to go from your mouth all the way out of your body, which is kind of crazy. So when we're referring to the alimentary canal or the GI tract, we're talking about your mouth, your pharynx, your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. But there are also accessory or support structures like your teeth, your tongue, salivary glands, gallbladder, liver, and pancreas. So we're going to talk about each of these things in our discovery stations. So before we get to that, though, I'm actually going to do an overview of the digestion process so that then when you're reading about each of the individual organs in the alimentary canal, you'll have the context of the role that they play within digestion. So think of digestion as like a disassembly line of your food. So we're taking apart your food piece by piece. And we divide it into 6 kind of overall steps, but these aren't necessarily sequential. Some of them are happening simultaneously, they're happening in multiple places at once. But just for the sake of understanding, I'm numbering them into 6 steps. But again, don't think of them as after number 2, then comes number 3, and then only after 3 is done, then comes 4. That's not the case at all. A lot of this is going on all at once. So first is ingestion. This step is actually only, I'll say that in a minute. Then we have propulsion, mechanical breakdown, chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. And ingestion is only happening in your mouth. These next 4 are happening in multiple organs along your GI tract, and they're all kind of working together cooperatively to accomplish these 4 steps. And then defecation is occurring only in your large intestine. Okay, I want to talk through each of these briefly so that you'll have some context before the discovery station. So first, ingestion. What is that? That's just eating. That's all it is. Your teeth are an accessory structure in the ingestion process. They start mechanical breakdown by chewing up your food. So we're already talking about the the third technically numbered step here. So again, there's overlap. So your teeth start crunching up your food. Your salivary glands, another accessory structure, they start the chemical digestion by releasing enzymes like amylase to start digesting foods like starches already in your mouth right there. After ingestion, which is happening in your oral cavity or your mouth, then we have propulsion. So this is the movement of food through your gastrointestinal tract. And this is happening throughout the whole entire process, through every structure really. It starts with voluntary swallowing of the bolus. Bolus is just what we would refer to the ball of chewed up food that's in your mouth. We refer to that as a bolus. So it starts with you choosing to swallow that. And then most of the rest is an involuntary process called peristalsis, which we can see pictured here, where essentially your smooth muscles that are in your esophagus and your stomach and your intestines, they contract and relax in order to propel or move the bolus and your digested food through the alimentary canal and then eventually out of your body. The mechanical breakdown is just the physical breakdown of the food you eat, and the purpose of that is twofold. One, to increase the surface area of the food that you've eaten, because that's going to help us with absorption. That's going to help us maximize what nutrients we're absorbing. But then also, think about as you're chewing and food's moving around in your mouth, you're mixing it with enzymes as well in your mouth and in other parts of your body. And that's going to help then with the chemical digestion portion. Chemical digestion is just we're using secreted enzymes in all these different structures of your body to chemically break down the food molecules that you've eaten into their simplest forms. Basically monomers, if you remember that term from Biology 1, so that then we're able to absorb into the blood what we need to use and then transport it via the blood to whatever cells need these nutrients. Absorption is the process of that transport of the end result of our digested food through the walls of the GI tract and into your blood. Or it can also be absorbed into lymph, which is something we're going to talk about in Unit 6, which is our protection unit. So we'll talk about the lymphatic system then. So for now, just really think of blood, and then it can then be transported. So these monomers, these vitamins, minerals, they'll then be used for cellular respiration in our cells. So going back to Biology 1, that's where this glucose that we talk about in cellular respiration, that's where it's coming from. Or just whatever other process is needed at the time. Maybe we're going to take amino acids and reassemble those into proteins that certain cells need to accomplish a process. It's totally dependent on what the cell needs and when. And then last is defecation, which is a fancy term for the elimination of the indigestible substances through the anus as feces or poop. So, we're going to stop in class and talk about all these different structures I've been mentioning in some detail through these stations, and you're going to label a big body diagram of them. But for the sake of the video, I'm going to keep trucking along. So, back in Unit 1, we talked about histology and tissues. And I want to kind of bring those up again and talk about some of the tissues very briefly that make up the gastrointestinal tract. Because you remember, one of the major themes of anatomy and physiology is that form dictates function. And so you're going to see how the structure or the form of the tissues that make up the GI tract are how the GI tract is able to do all the different roles that it does in accomplishing the digestion of our food. So, most of the structures in our GI tract have 4 main layers to them. So these are the actual layers of the organs. And if you remember, or from your text, or from forever ago when we did an intro to histology, you have the peritoneum, which is a serous membrane. That's are some serous membranes that are lining your abdominopelvic cavity. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the actual organs within your abdominopelvic cavity, and the layers of those tissues. So the innermost layer is mucosa, and it secretes mucus, enzymes, and hormones. And it also absorbs nutrients into the blood and protects against infectious diseases. The submucosa is the next layer, and it's a kind of a middle layer, and it's made of loose areolar connective tissue, and it gives the tube elasticity and some flexibility. Then you have the muscularis externa, which is a middle layer of smooth muscle, or it could be, multiple layers of smooth muscle. And these play a role in peristalsis, which is that propulsion process of how we move the food through the tract. And then we have serosa, which is the outermost layer of loose connective tissue. And that, when you look at this kind of close up here, we can see, and you can kind of see some other parts too, but that's where nerves and blood vessels and lymphatic vessels for each structure are going to be nourishing and playing a part. Continue with the histology. Just again, this is such a brief overview. Epithelial tissue also plays an important role in many of the organs by creating a selectively permeable lining. So specifically, stratified squamous epithelial cells in your mouth, esophagus, and anus are there to protect against abrasive foods. So think of when you've eaten something like really crunchy, like a Ruffle potato chip. That keeps it, that layer of epithelial cells is keeping your mouth from getting scratched essentially by that. And then we also have simple columnar epithelial cells that line our stomach and intestines, and those are critical for absorption and secretion of substances. All right, so connecting back all the way to Biology 1 and to Unit 1, Intro to Anatomy, where we reviewed basic biology concepts, I want to do a brief overview of some of the digestive enzymes that are playing a role in making the chemical digestion of our food possible, and where they are and what they're digesting. So amylase is a digestive enzyme. It's mainly in your saliva. Your salivary glands secrete it, and it starts the digestion of starches, which are, if you remember from Biology 1, are complex carbohydrates. So it starts that process in your mouth. And amylase is trying to break those starches down into a simpler subcomponent of it, which is maltose, which is a disaccharide. Other digestive enzymes are pepsin and HCl, hydrochloric acid, which are in the gastric juices that the stomach secretes. They help to digest proteins, and what they form is just partially digested proteins. So they're starting the process of breaking down proteins. Proteases, lipases, and amylase, like we mentioned up here, also are in the pancreatic juice that your pancreas secretes. And these help break down those proteins, fats that are in the bile, that are surrounded by bile, and also starches, which we started digesting here. And they can break down those proteins into peptides and amino acids, and break down those fats into fatty acids and glycerol, and break down starches into things like maltose, which is just a type of sugar. Peptidases, sucrase, lactase, and maltase are all intestinal enzymes that your intestines secrete. They digest peptides, which are just short chains of amino acids, and then also sucrose, lactose, and maltose, which are sugars. Lactose is specifically the sugar in milk. And it's going to break down those peptides into amino acids, and then sucrose, lactose, and maltose into monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, and galactose. So even simpler sugars. Remember, we're trying to get them down to their simplest forms in order for them to be absorbed. And then last are bile salts that are in your liver bile. They're not technically enzymes, but they help with the breakdown of fats. We couldn't break down fats without them, and they break down your fats into fat droplets that then are easier to be digested by the body and absorbed. Okay, so how is this all regulated? We're going to do a brief overview before we wrap up. So, the enteric nervous system, that prefix enter, it looks like enter, is just referring to gut. So anything that has that prefix is just referring to your gut. So it's like your gut's nervous system. This is an in-house nerve supply that's just for your GI tract for regulating activities of the digestive system. It's considered part of your autonomic nervous system, which that should be a very familiar term from Unit 3, Control and Coordination. And it has receptors that respond to external stimuli, such as seeing, smelling, tasting, or thinking about food. I mean, you can think about something that you really want to eat, like fresh pizza, and it'll make your mouth water. And that is because you have receptors that are responding to that. But also internal stimuli too. So an internal stimulus can be mechanical, like the actual stretching of your stomach, for instance, or it could be chemical, like a change in pH, or the presence of a certain end product can then cause some sort of signal. So this is all part of the enteric nervous system. So it's actually crazy. So we'll talk about the vagus nerve on the next slide, but it's actually been, studies have found that if we sever the vagus nerve, which is the cranial nerve that runs from your brain all the way into your abdomen, that the enteric nervous system can still function independently. So it's almost like an entirely independent secondary nervous system in your body, which is kind of crazy and pretty cool. So it communicates with your central nervous system via that vagus nerve I just mentioned, which is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It starts up here and goes all the way through your abdomen and all these different organs. It has both sensory receptors and then also motor functions as well. And again, it connects the brain to the GI tract and other things. But it's not just the nervous system. Your endocrine system has a role too, of course, because it is also part of controlling and coordinating everything in your body. So hormones have a significant role. Tons of examples of hormones. Like G cells, they produce a hormone called gastrin. Your enteroendocrine cells, so your gut endocrine cells, release hormones like serotonin and histamine. And then these hormones can increase and activate the release of things like hydrochloric acid and stimulate muscle contractions in your stomach and intestines, and do all of these things that make those 6 steps of the digestion process happen and make it possible. All right, last, gastric fluid secretion specifically. So that's what the fluid that's getting secreted into your stomach is controlled in 3 phases and or places. So I want to mention this under regulation before moving on. So first there's the cephalic phase, which is our reflex phase that's occurring in your brain. So this is before food even enters your stomach. You have external stimuli, like we mentioned, seeing or smelling food. Those signal your hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata in your brain, which triggers parasympathetic fibers in the vagus nerve to start prepping your food or your stomach to say that food's going to be coming. We should be stimulating the secretion of gastric fluid. You also have the gastric phase of regulation, which is actually happening in the stomach. So, mechanical stimuli get activated by stretch receptors in your stomach, and that causes the secretion of more gastric fluid. Chemical stimuli activate chemoreceptors in your stomach as well, which cause your G cells to release gastrin, which is the hormone that signals the increase of that HCl secretion. And then also your intestinal phase. So, this is happening in your intestines. Receptors in the duodenum receive chyme, and that causes intestinal cells to, again, secrete more gastrin. These are all examples of how each of these phases have stimulatory events, but similar signaling mechanisms work in these phases in the opposite direction in order to inhibit the secretion of gastric fluid. So it can work both ways, and this is how we are able to control the rate that the stomach is digesting food and thus emptying, and the small intestine is taking that on so that your small intestine doesn't get overloaded. Because once food has entered your small intestine, you can't throw it up anymore. And so we don't want to overload that system in your body. All right, that is concept 1, and we in class are now going to practice modeling the digestive system just so we can understand it a bit better.